Hello, so today I'm going to show you how to make your own ink using acrylic paint, gouache, watercolour or Pearlex powder. So let's see how easy this is. We'll firstly start with an easy one, which is this watercolour paint. I've just used a tube. You can obviously use a block and brush it on as well. But I like this if you're constantly trying to write something, and you can have loads of fun with watercolour paints. So I'm just going to use a little pot here that you can buy from Hobbycraft. Put a little bit of ink or paint into here. Okay. And using a pipette or one of these bottles full of distilled water. You want to use distilled water because if you use normal tap water, the chances are the ink is going to go mouldy and start smelling quite bad. So with watercolour, I don't really worry too much about how much water I'm putting in. I'm just going to get the right consistency so I can write with it. Put a little bit in to begin with. I'm just going to use the back end of my pen holder and give it a stir. What you're trying to do with the consistency is to get the balance right. You don't want it so watery that you can't control the ink as you're writing. The consistency apparently you're looking for is double cream, but I prefer a thinner consistency when I write. So let's see how this one looks. So if it's like this, it could potentially be a little bit too thick. So I know when my ink is too thick for me, when I haven't got any good hairlines. So we'll just test it again. So I think it's just on the edge, being a little bit too thick. I'm just going to add a couple more drops of water. Now I use drops of water rather than shoving it under a tap because you have more control, which is why I like these, or a pipette. Give it another stir. Give your pen holder a clean. And there you go. For me, that's perfect. I'm happy with that. So next is the ink that everybody loves, which is the metallic inks. They kind of, look like this. You can get copper, you can get rose gold, pewter, silver. You can get quite a lot of colours. Just make sure that when you are mixing them, some of the colours, or some of the powders are coated in oil, so they don't mix well with water. I usually stick to things like the rose gold, the gold and the silver. So using one of these little sticks, ice cream lolly sticks, I'm just going to pop a little bit in here, not too much. 2 scoops is enough, which is probably maybe a teaspoon and a half, maybe just under 2 teaspoons. And then because it's a powder, you need to bind it, otherwise it doesn't sit very well on paper. Once it dries, it can wipe away really easily. So my general rule of thumb is thirds, or just under a third. So a third of powder, a third of gum arabic, which you can get pretty much anywhere. I use the liquid and not the crystals. This is the one that I like to use. And you first of all stir this up. Do it slowly, otherwise the powder tends to blow out of the pot. Make sure it's really well mixed. And now very slowly start adding your distilled water. If you find you add a little bit too much distilled water, you can add more powder into it. You try to get the balance right, but I prefer to do this at the beginning and try not to make any mistakes. So add some water. Start with that. Slowly stirring, making sure it's really well mixed up, getting in all the corners of the bottle. All right, let's have a look. Obviously get prepared to get very inky and really messy when you do this, so always put something on your table. Let's have a look. This is copper. So I'd say it's just about right. I would say potentially a little bit too thick still, because you can see here my hairlines aren't very consistent. Add a dash more water, tiny bit. Give it a stir. It's clean. That's better for me, I'm happy with that. And just see how it looks on a card, because copper always looks lovely on imperial blue. You see these lovely hairlines that this ink is creating, so I know it's perfect for this paper. So next on the list is using gouache to make some ink. Gouache works really well, I find, on darker colours. It sits really well on like a dark blue. If you made this ink, like, you know, if you made a pale pink with acrylic, it probably wouldn't sit nicely on top of the paper, and the colour of the paper would show through. So that's why I prefer to use gouache, because it sits really nicely on the paper. You can use, this is a, I can't pronounce it very well, a Schminke designer's gouache, but there's also a Winsor & Newton, I believe, designer's gouache as well, which is, you know, which works really well too. So you need gouache. You need, again, gum arabic to make sure all the pigments are bound together when you're writing, otherwise they tend to crack, and distilled water. And again, it's a sort of the same method. I do a sort of a third gouache, third gum arabic, and a third water. Let's see how this goes. So, enjoyable noise. Some gum arabic in there just to bind it. Now this is my method. You might be, you know, if you're a calligrapher and you do your own ink, you know, each their own. You might be wincing what I'm doing, but this one works well for me and my projects. So give it a good stir. And now, because I want this to be quite opaque, I'm going to be really careful with the water that I'm putting in. Sometimes if you make the ink too thin, it will just be quite transparent. So it's basically adding drops until you get the consistency you want. If you write it, if you're practicing it on one paper, it might look perfect, and it might not look different. It might look different on a different type of paper. So if you're using like a Rhodia or a vellum based paper, it's always going to work really well. So try, when you're making it, testing it on a scrap of paper that you'll actually be writing on, because I do find colour plan can be quite tricky to write on sometimes, even though it's the, in my opinion, perfect paper for calligraphy. So maybe start adding water and aim to sort of a double cream consistency and test it, and then start adding more water until you get to where you want to go. You know, it's writing it, in my opinion, quite well on here. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's see how it works on here. Again, if you're using sort of the metallics or the inks like this, you're going to have to mix regularly, because they do tend to separate, and you don't want to be writing with pinky water. Now personally, I feel that it's ever so slightly transparent on here. I think I can get away with it, but what I would do, if I'm not in a rush, I would leave this overnight just to evaporate a little bit, and then tomorrow it would be the perfect consistency. but that pink and that blue works really well together. Okay, last but not least, it's acrylic. Sometimes acrylic can be really fun to mess around with. Sometimes it can break you. I have done before a really good fluorescent acrylic paint, which I'm really happy with. Types of acrylic paints that I use: sometimes I use a System 3, sometimes I use a PBO, and I've recently discovered this really nice acrylic from Hobbycraft that I quite like to use. Now, you don't need gum arabic for this, because obviously it's already bound together anyway. So there you go. There you go, maybe just over a third. Slowly add your water. Add a little bit to begin with, so when you mix, it makes it easier to mix. You don't have big blobs of paint everywhere. Add some more. So you can kind of see there it's still a little bit too thick. The consistency is way too thick. Just slowly get in there now. Alright, so I'm just going to try that one out. I'm happy with that. As soon as I get that lovely hairline, I know that I'm doing well. Really pleased with that. Just fill that in ever so slightly. So, if you enjoyed this and you find it really helpful, please comment below. It'd be fantastic if you can like and subscribe to these videos. There'll be lots more how-tos coming up in the future. Take care, have a good day, bye.